maybe to sort of like back up slightly, I think this is a good point to bring up something, maybe a little bit of a quibble with the whole positive negative liberty distinction. The it seems clear to me that the sort of the positive versus negative liberty, like that is sort of emerges out of the liberal conception of the economy as, the self-regulating market, that the economy is a sort of freestanding institution. And so therefore that is totally natural and normalized, and doesn't have anything to do with the state. And therefore, you know, negative liberty is just not not interfering with that natural self-regulating process, and so therefore that the only thing the state can do with the economy is to take away that natural, like, free exercise of choice and markets and whatever. But what the this is a false notion, right? The economy is largely created by the state. Markets are created by the state. Property is a state creation. And I think maybe an interesting thing to bring in is sort of like the idea of consent, because in my view, at bottom, there is always like a very great degree of coercion that's happening. Like people's negative liberty is being infringed all the time. You're forced to do all kinds of crap. From going to get a job in a capitalist system, to paying your taxes, to not crossing the street when the light's against you, and on and on. What side of the road do you drive on? And I think the really key thing from our sort of left-wing perspective is consent. It's how you allocate that coercion, whether it's through a democratic process where everyone gets a say, and then you have certain sort of civil liberties protections on top of that, so designating certain sorts of things as sort of like categorically illegitimate, and therefore that that whatever coercion is happening, it's a result of a sort of collective process and a collective agreement, and so on. And that sort of the hegemonic thing, it's like that the freedom that's coming at the for the freedom to own other people is clearly just an enormous violation of nobody consents to being a slave, in that sense, or their own descendants being slaves, right? And that I'd always just like to break out of that sort of libertarian jujitsu, and trying to think of the economy as this freestanding institution, and to recognize that the problem is scarcity. There never is enough resources for everyone to have everything they want all the time. And so you sort of have to decide where their things are going to go. And so, that means property, that means taxation, and so on. But I think that, consent is the real, the way that can be dealt with in a productive way. At least that's my view. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the big distinction, right? With capitalism, we have control of our economy, and answering that question of scarcity, what are we going to produce and not produce with our scarce resources? The market economy, that lies in the hands of business and supposedly in consumers if they have lots of options, as we see in the book and all of the markets around us. Like, we often get big old monopolies or oligopolies with just a couple of firms and very limited choices on our part, and this includes all of our modern tech platforms on down the line economically. And that monopolization or oligopolization really takes our consent out of the economic process. But that's the whole idea, right, with socialism, or some version of that idea. And obviously that's a lot of different schools of thought that go into that flag, and that's the reality. But the idea there is there's some form of popular decision making, right? Some economic democracy. The classic idea was worker control of the means of production, like worker control of the economy, basically. So when you go to work, you have all the information that management keeps for itself. You talk to your coworkers about what you want to produce and how you want to do it, and you send representatives to talk to related businesses and use those principles of free association to try to experiment and find different ways of organizing production. But because there it's all based on, that more of a worker sovereignty picture. And usually, especially with the modern ideas about socialism, people want to have some formal political process too, where we have the ability to choose on a masser basis, on a greater basis, what economic plan is chosen out of the options that the planners have come up with and stuff. But that puts that consent issue, back into a sort of democratic or a republic framework, where we are supposed to have some sort of influence over the course of these events. I mean, my God, look at our great economic trends in the last 20, 30 years. Like, what about this comes from the public will? Charging people to kingdom come for their school and for their healthcare, and making the cities completely unaffordable to live in, shipping out decent blue-collar jobs to foreign hellholes so that we can make things more cheaply. All these things are just insanely unpopular. Because, it's capitalism, though. No one gives a shit about what's popular. There's a couple of firms, buy a product, you probably aren't going to hear about where it comes from because they pour money into ads and PR to steer you away from thinking about and engaging with these issues in the first place. Again, this all just speaks to the power that the industries have and how they violate our freedom. But I think that's absolutely right. Like, that basic scarcity relationship, that is the source of all of our economic institutions, like you said, from property relations like we have now towards some way we might run them in a perhaps socialist future. And that's true too, like your very first comment there, that so much about the market economy, which conservative writers and figures have, I don't know why, they're so intent on insisting that's the natural order, that's the way things work, any other process or structure is unnatural. It's so goofy, for a bunch of reasons, but the best reason, I think, is what you said. Like, the state creates most of the conditions for markets to operate, from basic public order to, very importantly, having court and legal systems to enforce business contracts. People don't realize what a incredibly foundational thing that is to have any kind of large-scale economy, but certainly a capitalist one where it's all about companies having the confidence to invest. And if they sign big contracts with the steel company so they can put up a building, the company will actually deliver the steel on time and at the specified quality levels. And if they don't, they can take him to court. Without that, who's going to make an investment? It's risky enough already, So that's a really important point. And it's something that is really annoying too. When people claim, oh, that's the natural system, government's an intrusion, it takes away our freedom. Capitalism is a power-riddled system that relies on the state at 30 different budget lines to create the foundation of economic. I think I totally agree with it.
Yeah, that's why capitalism is so pernicious on the ideological level, right? Because it tries to pretend that it's the only naturalized system, and that therefore anything that challenges it is what is being chosen to challenge the status quo and is the threat, and is that where, which is threatening your freedom from. The government's getting involved, big government. But unmasking the way that the government and the state, and basically how Karl Polanyi showed that it's actually what's spontaneous is the reaction to the devastation, right, of the planned capitalist political economy. That is something that can help people realize, as I think is, whether it's in the misguided election of Trump or in the rise of, democratic socialists, there seems to be some insight into the failures and perhaps not so natural disasters caused by neoliberalism. And so maybe this is a good time, as much as we could keep diving into the takedowns, which I always love, of Friedman and Hayek. But maybe we should talk a bit about the kind of options on offer for the left to reappropriate freedom, that is tied to the common good, that is tied to, all the things that neoliberalism tries to subvert. So, I think you frame it in a few ways. I think you label one vision that you have as libertarian socialism, which is interesting given the takedown of libertarianism. So we could talk about that. And the kind of the non-statist way that form of socialism, kind of supports us operating. But also I really liked the fact that you talk about the need to experiment and to have a little humility about the fact that we can't know in advance too much about the way to truly be free, because we've lived so much under the oppression of these other systems, right? And so maybe we can start talking about your vision for the solution.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Matt, for sure. Like a lot of people these days, I'm looking more favorably on non-capitalist ways of organizing our system at the broadest level. And yeah, like right now, it's a real socialist moment, and you don't have a ton of those historically, so that's kind of exciting. But of course, there's a ton of confusion. This has come up a bunch in the campaign already among Sanders and AOC and other figures nationally, using the word socialism and talking about what it is and isn't. And Sanders has I'm a huge fan of Bernie Sanders, but he's muddied the waters a little bit more about what socialism is, but mostly in the way that favors the use of the term. So maybe it's all for the best. But when he uses it, he means social democracy in Europe, right? Or usually an expansion of the New Deal policies we used to have. We still have private ownership of most property, but we're going to tax the rich, which will come up with revenue for public health care, and reduce their power levels by taxing them, which is important. And take all these other steps. I think all this stuff is fantastic. I'm in favor of modest moves in the near term, especially stuff like universal health care, because that makes such a huge difference in the lives of working people. I wish we had it just for myself to benefit from it,
Yeah.
So,
yeah, same.
Yeah, it comes from the heart. So there's that. But then looking a little bit beyond that, you have a couple different schools of traditional ideas about what socialism is. Like democratic socialism or social democracy usually means some version of reforming capitalism with taxes and public programs and regulation, and that there's a lot to be accomplished there. That's a very reasonable goal for improving our lives while we're physically living them. That's nice. When we talk about real socialism, though, we're usually talking about something post-capitalist, right? So your big-scale property, big industries, giant farm tracts, giant mines of controlling raw materials, or the huge server farms of today that store all of our data and let us watch stupid YouTube videos about cats with low latency. Very important, all equally important industries. But what they do is they give their owners a lot of power. If they decide to make a big dramatic change with what they're going to do in their industries, it affects everybody. So once you get up to a level of property that gives you real power, and it's debatable where that would be in different industries and different countries probably would like to chop it up differently. At that point, we'd say that property should be socialized. There's too much potential power there for one per CEO or one group of investors to control it. So the workers and the community and people with other concerns in it, they'll run it in some form of democratic process with some form of representation and recall of their representatives and so on. That kind of thing for like an actual democratic control of the workplace and federating with other workers and other industries around the economy and around the world. Like that's more of a traditional, real bottom-up socialist vision. Libertarian socialism, all these words get abused quite a bit, so there's really aren't that hard of a set of boundary lines between these. That's where we're sort of focusing on perhaps further down the road from that to where we no longer have the need for a giant centralized state in addition to these giant centralized companies we want to get rid of in the nearer term, because like you guys brought up before, it is the republic for all of our government's problems. Plenty. There's so much coercive power, especially in big, powerful countries like the United States. It is a republic. We have some veto power and some real control over what the state does. And if you're a more active, more organized polity, like say in France, if there's a really unpopular regressive policy that comes through, like taxing gasoline, very regressive tax on poor and working people, the population rises up on a somewhat organized basis, organized enough to shut down the economy. Like that's how you keep the state at bay while allowing more socialism to happen at the meantime, But I think the last thing you referred to, that's something that's really important to me. And that may be because I come out of the sciences. My background actually originally was in biology. That's what I did for my undergrad years, and then I went on to econ because we all make mistakes in our lives and do things that can be wrong. So, what can you do? But there, if you're trying to figure out a new system or design any kind of just a simple way of measuring something scientifically, the whole process, it's just understood that the process is experimental. Okay, well, I have this kind of early idea, so this suggests this method. Okay, that didn't really work out. This tiny piece looks promising. Let's try that in 6 different ways. That's how you optimize a process, or at least make it workable. And we should realize, We don't have a history of a successful developed economy that then went into socialism. We have various third world countries of different types, from Russia to China to others, that undergo an authoritarian development regime and wave the socialist flag for it, and then fail for their own reasons or because the most powerful countries in the West undermine them. It's a mixture in the history. But we don't really have an example of developed economies developing into socialism, which has always been the idea. Socialism would come from the most developed countries first, where people have the literacy and the expectation of civil liberties, and are brought together in big production units and all the reasons that you read about in Marx and stuff. There we don't have it. So the point is, if you are going into unmapped territory, you should have an experimental attitude. What, you're the magic wizard who knows how we should organize the tire production industry? What about the airline industry? What about the copper industry? What about making servers so we can run map software and the cloud? You're not going to have magical clairvoyance powers, even if you're an expert on an industry. And I love industrial analysis. You can learn a lot about how markets work. But it's the people who work in an industry every day. They're the ones who know what really goes on and how it really operates. They're the ones who are in a position to do experiments with their strong familiarity and knowledge. That should be, at least in my personal view, the idea for how we can get to socialism once we create that political and economic space, which probably would mean national political action to give workers some sanction for maybe doing sit-in strikes or however else they try to directly seize the means of production. You do need some kind of enabling law there to make that stable. But with that sort of national thing in the background, the impetus for the development should be at the workforce level and at their own voluntary organic federation, across production. That would be a kind of a vague vision for an experimental development of socialism. And we should have a little humility. Even if you have really important contributions to make, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't talk about this, of course, but just to say in doing so, it's no one sailed in these seas before if we go down this road. So we should just have that little willingness to doubt our own proposals and be modest. I don't think that's asking too much of it.
Why?
As all the wonks are taking off their wizard hats, all the wonks in DC are kind of had that sad, I thought I could be the wizard of this. Sorry, Ryan. I don't mean to insult the brilliant DC wonks, but yeah, they can't be the wizards. It's unfortunate.
Well, I don't live in DC anymore, so that's. But. Oh, I was going to say, there is an example that I think is somewhat instructive. So you have the Nordic model of, classic social democracy, very, 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 very generous welfare state. But there's considerable diversity in the Nordics. Sweden is probably the most neoliberalized, Denmark somewhat to a lesser extent, but Norway they really have socialized great swaths of wealth, right? So the Norwegian state owns 60% of all the wealth in Norway. And if you exclude owner-occupied homes, they own 75% of the wealth. And the state owns about 40% of all the stocks traded on the Norwegian stock exchange. And they've built up this gigantic social wealth fund, which mainly just sitting on it for now, but it owns 1.3 something percent of all the equities in the world. And that's kind of a peculiar result of their own political development, and also the fact that they struck oil big time in the North Sea, and they used that money. They did the smart thing. Don't do Venezuela. Don't do Alaska, where you're using your oil rents to fund current spending. Bad. Never do that, because then you're highly vulnerable to a price collapse, which is exactly why Alaska is shutting down its university system, and a big part of why Venezuela is in such a terrible state, in addition to the U.S. sanctions and massive corruption. But, they really have blazed a trail there in Norway. And, the fact is the U.S. has tons of oil wealth, but you don't need oil wealth. You could do the same thing with regular old taxes. You could just buy out businesses or expropriate ones that are really socially toxic. And that, I'm a little I guess I'm a little bit skeptical of the libertarian vision because of that same experimental, notion that like, well, here's a really workable example of pretty. I mean, I'd say it's pretty inarguable that Norway is the most socialist country that's ever existed, and it's pretty sweet. They're usually them and Finland are usually number 1 and 2 in the world's happiest countries survey that they do, and it's also dark as hell most of the time. So considering seasonal affective disorder, that's even more impressive. And cold. It's like 7 feet of snow, 8 months a year. So it's a pretty impressive example. I think there's a lot to learn from them. Maybe not. It's clearly not a perfect one-to-one correspondence with the U.S. in a lot of ways, but I think that's a pretty relevant place we could learn a lot from.
Oh, absolutely, man. I mean, I think many people on the left for a lot of years we've fought conservatives by bashing them in the head with successful, stable, happy, growing, egalitarian Scandinavia, and they've got it coming, and we should continue to do that. I think that's completely right. And it's interesting, watching reaction in Sweden, like that's been very painful. But you're right though. As far as like social democracy, Norway is going strong. But it's interesting. I mean, like you said, like the reason Norway, it has this whole history, but its whole modern period with social democracy, like you said, is completely funded by that gigantic North Sea set of oil assets there. Even with the lower prices that prevail in today's fracking era in the commodity markets, it's still been a gigantic bonanza for the very modest number of people who actually live in that country. If you look at it, it's
about 5 million.
Yeah, so the point is I would agree that they've been able to achieve a huge amount, and I think we should be holding that example up to every conservative until they realize how lame they are. On the other hand, we should realize it does come from doing at least as much as the rest of the world in dooming civilization by burning fossil fuels. Like it is a whole engine that's funded on, and like you said, like they're investing it mostly, rather than consuming it, which is always the sensible investment advice. And, countries have acute needs. They maybe have people who are starving of serious diseases. It's understandable if some of that money is put into social supports. The goal is, to invest the balance of it so it grows and makes stable income flows over time. Including in the future when, God willing, we won't be burning so many motor fuels and oil, using it for other purposes like plastic feedstock. So that's a good point, just that Norway's, the climate ramifications kind of undermine the specific Norway model. I agree that doesn't mess with its actual policy points. But the big thing I always point out there, too, is, that's fantastic, like the government owning 40% of the traded stocks and over half of the broader social wealth, and far more if we exclude, just the simple housing stock. But, of course, too, just along with that, we should remember, of course, government ownership isn't itself quite socialism. Many, even very well-run, constructive public entities are quite authoritarian and have super rigid hierarchical structures everyone's completely expected to follow along with. So I always think there is some value to doing that distinction between nationalizing and socializing. And, of course, they totally can and should go together. Government expropriates an industry, and the workers, or bodies of the workers in some form, or groups of them, get put in charge of the property. Separate itself from just nationalization, where the UK government takes over an unprofitable segment of the economy to keep it alive, or like the American, like Amtrak is the classic example there. The rail operator oligopolies didn't want to keep providing passenger service, and so to keep it in existence at all, the government steps in and does it. But it's not quite Amtrak. You talk to the porters and the clerks and the conductors on Amtrak; they are not making the decisions about what happens on the railroad too.
That's right.
That is fantastic, though. I mean, that's a great point. That Scandinavian model, though, hugely valuable lessons there. I could not possibly.